When the sound of Nadine Blair with What a Mighty God. Yeah.
Nobody loves like you.
Yes, we are back inside that you have been doing well. I've been, put it this way, the scripture says, rejoice with them that rejoice, and mourn with them that mourn. But I am back inside the program, and I am ready to get in this interview, a two-parter. I tell you, I wonder if this might even end up to be a three-parter. We've done that before inside the live highlights with a man from the UK, King Arthur. I tell you. I'll give the answer for mental size in just a few. Somebody actually has the answer. Do you? Somebody nailed it. Somebody has the answer. Hi, Carol. How you doing? So if you are with me on Facebook and YouTube, you will see my guest once more, Pastor Francios Meek. And he's from the Redeemed Deliverance Church of God in Wakefield, Trelawney. And last week he shared the first part of his story, one of transformation from what would have been a life of violence, crime, and God just intervened in the most dramatic way. Welcome again, Francios Meek.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for having me.
I'm wondering if your phone was ringing off the hook last week after part one.
Yes, definitely. I had many calls. My mother in the United States had many calls.
Yeah.
People were just amazed, and they were in awe, of what happened.
Well, I trust that today will still be awe-inspiring, because last week in closing, you mentioned that a part of your family, were heavily involved, practicing, the practitioners themselves of witchcraft, obeah. Tell us a bit more on that and the struggle that brought in your own life.
So my grandfather was, a obeah man, as we call him in Jamaica, practicing. When I was born, my grandmother had already left him. My grandmother had gotten married to him at an early age. They had, some children, 7 children, and while living with him, she got converted to Christianity. Yes. Funny enough, where my grandfather lived, the house is still there. It is close to the church, close to the New Testament Church of God, like a stone throw away.
Yeah.
You can stay at the church and you can look down into my grandfather's house. So it's pretty close. You can walk. There's a shortcut you can take from there. So they are neighbors. The pastor and my grandfather are neighbors. And so, yes. And so my grandmother got saved, and she left him and left, that lifestyle. They moved. My mother moved with her. At the time, my mother had my older brother. He's 5 years older than I am.
Yeah.
Both of them are listening now, I'm sure. And they went to, this was in a place we call Top Mountain. So they moved not very far away to where my grandmother's mother had a house
Mm-hmm.
um, called Caneep,
Mm-hmm.
within the same vicinity, but a little distance away.
Yeah.
And so that is where I was born. I was born in my grandmother's bedroom, um, and I lived there. My grandmother was a staunch Pentecostal Christian, Church
Yeah.
of God Christian. Very very powerful. She would see things, she would hear things. She'd pray for people and they'd get healed, and so forth and so on. So I was fostered in that sort of environment. Some of my other cousins, along with my aunt and uncle, lived closer to where my grandfather lived.
Yeah.
They had more interactions with him on a daily basis. Of course, I knew him. I'd go there because he's my grandfather and stuff. Now, as I grew, I was brought up on the other side, which is where my grandmother was. I'd have to go to church, on Sundays, Sunday school and stuff. But my grandmother was a Sunday school teacher, and on days when rain fell and we couldn't attend church, she had her blackboard, she had her chalk. You wouldn't escape it, you know.
So she taught Sunday school at home.
Yes, man. Yes, and she kept a service at home.
Yeah.
She kept a service at home. She would on Sunday mornings religiously. You'd have to wake up like at 5 in the morning for prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Every evening religiously at 6 o'clock. She'd have prayer.
Yeah.
And she could pray. My grandmother would pray for an hour with ease,
Ease. Wow.
with ease. She knew the Bible so well that in my early years reading the scriptures, if I made a mistake, she would know what mistakes I made
And
without
you're
even.
reading from the text and from her memory she would
Yeah,
teach you.
yeah, yeah, man,
Powerful.
yeah, man, yeah, man. Because that along with her daily bread and her song book were the only books I
Which
know
one?
she read.
Sanctuary or Redemption?
She had a redemption, and she
Mm-hmm.
had one of the it's now the black back, but at the time it was a red back, a small, which the Church of God uses.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So those were the only things I can recall her reading. And she would read. She would every day. She'd be buried in her scriptures and stuff. um so I was brought up in that sort of environment.
Yeah.
I was fostered there. So to a great extent, I never in my early years had much dealings with my grandfather, other than
Yeah.
when I was, passing by, saying hi. I went to visit him and so forth and so on. And so, but they would have their his thing was very serious. He took it very seriously. He would have, like, every year in July, the last Saturday of July, last weekend of July. July usually have five Saturdays, I think. So on the last weekend of July, they'd have like a festival.
Oh,
Yes, they'd have like a festival. Saturday night, Sunday night, sometimes leading into Monday sort of thing.
what type of
Where
festival?
so people from everywhere would attend. They would set up tables, different kinds of tables.
Oh,
Ground tables. They would set up high tables. They would have different kinds of food items, bread.
food on the
Yeah, man.
tables.
Yes, man. Bread. They'd break bread. They'd have fruits, and they would invoke the ancestral spirits because they were Maroons. They are from the Maroon lineage. So
Oh,
yeah, so they'd invoke those spirits. They'd have interactions with the dead from the burying ground, and because we had family plots, and so they'd go, and there was a certain way you had to speak to the dead, to invoke the spirits and stuff. Yeah, man. So there were these sorts of stuff, and they'd kill animals. They'd have fowls and goats and pigs and stuff that were reared specifically for
for the
this for
sacrifice.
this
For
yes
the
for,
table.
yes, for this event. They'd have drums. They'd make their drums from animal skin, and they'd have these drums, and they'd beat drums, and all these sorts of stuff. They had certain songs that they would sing, and people would come from everywhere. It was a sight to behold. People in the community and out of the community from various parts of Jamaica would come, and some would even stay for the duration,
For the weekend.
and they would, yeah, and they had everything. They would have, like, alcohol. They'd have everything would be there, and you know all sorts of things would happen. I have been
You,
there perhaps
you have
like
to tell us
maybe
the all sorts of
twice.
things, you know.
Yeah, so I'm getting to that. So I've been there. So when I got older, so this is how it worked. In my early years, even before I envisioned being involved in ministry,
Yeah.
the church would usually have a function, you know, rally or one of those things around July. It usually clashes with my grandfather's event.
Oh. Huh.
So what normally happens is that so one year, and this was very early. This happened twice, but one year early, as I left church, this I was old, and I was probably about 12, 13, and I went by, um passing by to go home, and I stopped. My family members are there, my cousins are there, and other family members and stuff. And I passed by, and I stopped. And during these events, this is not the I'm not telling you any fairy tales. I'm not telling you any stories. This is with,
I believe you.
yeah,
I love
where
these
you
things.
have you have demonic spirits taking possession of people's body, and,
Hmm.
and all sorts of things happening. So while my uncle is under the influence of the spirit, not the Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
he he says, Pastor, where are you? You're there, man. You know. So from an early age, they identified me as that. And even after my grandfather
So
died.
hold on. So he was referring to you and say you're
Yeah,
a
yeah,
pastor.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
um at that time, I had no sense of God's calling on my life or anything
Hmm.
like that. And a few years later, when I got older, again I was passing. By this, my grandfather had died, and my uncle had taken on.
Taking over the reins, and he
Right,
was
right,
administering all the
right, right,
festivities.
right. And then my grandfather's spirit, you know, was possessing him. Again, he said to me, Pastor, you're there, man. What you doing here? You know?
Mm.
Yeah, because in passing, I mean, they are my family members. In passing, I'd stop and I'd say hello, and stuff. So we had those kinds of experiences. But one year, I actually attended. I was probably about 14,
Hmm.
15, somewhere there. And I mean, you see crazy stuff. You see things happening, like you see men climbing trees upside down, because the spirits the spirits have been invoked, and to a certain extent, anything goes. You don't know what is going to happen.
Mm.
And I saw at that particular time, my aunt was possessed by the spirit, and she danced that night. And this is no joke. She danced that night from, this was like about 10, 11 in the night, because the drums are being played. The drums are oiled, and, rum is placed on them and stuff, and beat the
So
drum.
oil and rum is placed on the drum as well.
Yeah, man, they rum the drum, and, yeah, you play the drum, and drums are being played non-stop, and songs are being sung. And she danced like from about 10, 11 the night until probably about 3, 4 the morning, non-stop.
Non-stop.
Yeah, nonstop. There have been experiences where my uncle has entered into a fire. He danced in a fire. He was not feeling any burn. Of course, you saw the effects of that afterwards, but he wasn't feeling anything. You know, Cases of a cousin, you know, drinking a 3.5 pint bottle of rum without water. Bottoms up and not being drunk and all of these stuff.
Mm.
Yeah. Cases of fowl's head being severed from its body, and then you throw rum on the fowl, and the fowl without head gets up and starts to run. So so I've seen those
You've
sorts of
seen quite
stuff.
a lot.
Yeah. We've seen those sorts of stuff. But for us, I mean, it was not something that scared us, because um, even if you weren't involved in it per se, it is something that you've come to accept
Yeah, I mean,
as
because it's culture, they say.
definitely it's a part of your reality. So for us, even like as children, we were not necessarily participating in those sorts of stuff. It was not forced on us per se, but you grew up in this environment and you embrace that as being a part of your reality. So yeah, I've seen those sorts of stuff.
Wow. So, so now, wow, wow. We're talking with Pastor Francois Meek of the Redeemed Deliverance Church of God in Trelawney, but his early years had quite, different, quite a dramatic twist from being the bad boy who was influencing many others to being head boy. And then now he's sharing his story of his family's involvement in deep witchcraft. Deep. Wow. So now, you know, was there ever a pull on you personally to be involved, or what was the conflict that existed there?
So for me, I mean, there wasn't any there wasn't any significant pull, I would say.
Okay.
As I mentioned to you, that my life was spent with my grandmother.
So that
So
was firmly rooted.
yeah, so me being there was occasional, was on various occasions, and most times when I went to visit my grandfather, it was during normal times, just a visit. Um, yeah, because he was a farmer as well. He had a lot of lands, like 57 acres of lands, um, and so it was big on that. I'd go there in the mornings. He'd make cow's milk and those sorts of stuff, and he'd give you, jovial person. So that was my experience with him per se. He died when I was pretty young, when I was probably about 12, going on to 13 years old. Then things went dormant for a little while because my uncle, who the baton was passed to, he was living abroad.
Oh,
And so, yes, he still lives abroad, so things were somewhat dormant. Every now and then you would have a case where, or sometimes very regular, you'd have a case where my aunt would work in Kingston, and because my uncle is not there, when my aunt comes home, the spirit would take possession of her body. You know,
how did you come to the recognition of the evil of it? That this
okay,
is demonic. Yeah, because in a culture, in a community, so many individuals are just used to it, and such an activity being beside a church, I was that is a culture, and many people in Jamaica still think that it's just a matter of culture, and
right,
don't see the evil. How did you personally recognize
right.
the evil in it?
So that came through my grandmother, from very early. So as I mentioned, my grandmother was very influential in my life, very, very influential. The kind of person I am today is to a great extent, you know, um, as a result of her shaping and molding me being able to read, me being able to write. My grandmother was very instrumental in all of that. When my mother would get angry, my grandmother would say, "Left the boy," and pull me aside, and she would hold my hand and she would help me to write and stuff.
Wow.
Yes, she taught me how to read properly through the Bible and those sorts of stuff. And so from very early, she was against that. That's why she left.
Yeah.
And she was making no bones about that. That was not something she was hiding, and she would tell us constantly that that is evil. And so when they had their meetings each year, a lot of food was there, a lot of meat was there, you know,
Mm.
a whole lot of food, a whole lot of meat and stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
glamorous experience. And none of that food could come to the house. Even if we were hungry, my
Yeah.
grandmother would say, "Look here, I don't want any of that. Let it stay where it is, because
Wow.
I am not going to be a partaker in that, or in anything that comes from there."
In that table, yeah.
Right. And so I had to be there. My mother had left with my grandmother, as I said. So it's not like my mother was going there either when they had these events. And even though she was a Christian, but she wasn't going there, she had already sided with my mother, my grandmother. So none of them were going there. And if my mother was not going, my early years, if my mother wasn't going somewhere, it doesn't matter where it was, I wasn't going.
Oh, okay.
So I missed many opportunities because I was going to stay with my mother, because my mother was always left at home alone. And I missed out on going to many places because I preferred to stay with her,
Okay.
because we had that kind of relationship. So from very early, my grandmother would point out that. And as I grew, and as I became more aware and more conscious of God, I recognize, that was not something you wanted to be a part of. That is something that does no good for your life.
Speak,
You know,
speak to somebody in Jamaica who perhaps is under the impression that it's just a matter of culture. It's just culture. Nothing is really wrong with it.
it is more than culture, because it entails giving up a part of one's life. It entails becoming personally entangled in a life of evil,
Mm,
opening up one's life to satanic influence,
yeah.
to spiritual darkness. That is what it entails. And you have to pay a price. There's a price you have to pay, for that.
Explain.
Because at the end of the day, when you do that, that affects your relationship with God. It affects your vision of God. It blurs your vision of God. It
Mm-hmm.
steers you away. It is contagious. It is something that once you are in it, you are going to want to continue in it, because there are many facets of it, that keeps you involved in it. There are rituals that you have to participate in. There are sometimes, in some of these cases, you may have to take baths. They may require that you do things where candles are concerned, and you may have to
Mm,
use parchment papers, and
mm-hmm.
you may have to do all sorts of stuff. It involves all sorts of stuff. You may have to denounce a certain aspect of your life. So
Mm.
these things take a toll on you. You may have to make sacrifices where your children are concerned. In many cases, some of these things come with you having to give up a family member, you having to sacrifice someone who is close to you,
Right
and
here
all
in
sorts
Jamaica.
of stuff.
Right
Huh?
here in Jamaica.
Yeah,
In
yeah,
these
yeah, yeah.
so-called cultural practices.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So,
Wow.
so these things are very dangerous.
Yeah. Wow. 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 I mean, just wow. Not many times, listeners, and I'm sure you can back me up, not many times you hear a pastor, having experienced all of this and being rescued from the clutches of such a life, even from an early age. And we certainly thank God for a praying and a dedicated grandmother. Now, how did you personally, shifting from that a bit, how did you personally recognize the call of God for yourself? Individuals on the other side would see it, calling you pastor on multiple occasions,
Right.
in the midst of their tables and feasts and all of these things.
Mhm.
But how did you come to the recognition that, hey, this is what God is leading me to?
So many things happened along the way. When I was 17, I was in my final year of high school. Um, my grandmother and I went to a particular church. The pastor's name was Pastor Creed in Port Maria, and they were having a fasting service. And she called me out, and she said that the Lord has me to sow a seed in the ministry. At the time, I was kind of, even though I'd heard it, before, I still wasn't necessarily. I was like, I'm not saying no, but even if that is the case, it is not going to happen now. Yeah, because I have my own plans. Now, I left that, I was continuing with life and stuff. About a year later, I had applied to the University of the West Indies of Technology to do mechanical engineering and stuff. Um, and then about a year later, I was at a crusade in Richmond at the New Testament Church of God. And this evangelist, I think his name was Dwight Peku, who who came to preach that night. Nobody knew I was coming, so nobody could have. It wasn't my church, a church in my district at the time, but nobody knew I was coming, so nobody could have told him. He never knew me, and so forth and so on. And I went. He preached. He was preaching from Ephesians, talking about spiritual warfare and stuff. And at the end of his preaching, during his preaching, he said, like, he looked at, pointed at me, and he said, "I call you. You should have did long time, because a whole heap of time them over here and try to kill you and all these sorts of stuff and the whole works." And at the end of his preaching, he called me up to the altar and he said, "Let me look into your past." He said, "You were a head boy at school." Um, and nobody knew that I was going to be there, so nobody could have told him that.
Yeah.
And he said some other stuff about my life, about my past life, and some of the experiences that I had. And he said, "Let me look into your future." He said the Lord said that you must go to Bible college, and that He is going to make the way,
Yeah.
that He's going to provide the money, and so forth and so on, because He has called you to the ministry. By this now, I had already started having some experiences where, as I mentioned last week, I would go to sleep, and I would dream that I'm preaching, and I'd wake up and I'd have this yearning just to preach.
To preach, yeah.
Yeah, and that's unusual, because anybody who knows me will tell you that I was never the front up person.
Oh.
Behind the scenes, I I
Mm-hmm.
I could talk, I could
Mm-hmm.
talk, but I was a very shy person when it came onto the crowd. I never liked crowds and stuff.
Yeah.
Still don't like crowds and stuff. I prefer to work behind the scenes. And then so I started having these experiences. Of course, I had preached before, like about 6 months after I got saved. I had preached, done exhortation, and stuff, but nothing serious
Yeah.
at the time. And then I think I'd preached one time after that, but again, short kind of preaching. But I started having this yearning, this hunger for preaching, and him saying this to me now, I'd applied to UTech, never heard anything from them at the time. And the next day, I ran down to Mandeville from St. Mary, and I went to Bethel. I got the application form, I applied to Bethel, and
That was quick.
yeah, 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 very quick, and I applied, and Bethel was the last place I applied to. And I applied to Jagas before, and I applied to UTech and stuff. Bethel was the last place I applied to. But Bethel was the first place that replied to me,
Replied. Wow.
saying that I got accepted. And then after Bethel told me that I got accepted,
Yeah.
then Jagas called me saying that I got accepted. And then when I went off to Bethel, my mother said she got a letter from UTech saying I got accepted.
Mm.
So, so all these things lined up, and by this now I started to explore preaching.
Okay.
I started to preach at crusades and street meetings and stuff. So I was 18 at the time.
Pretty young, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, preached at within my community though. I was preaching in my
Okay.
community at street meetings and crusades and stuff, pulling out crowds, because everybody, especially youngsters, knew, my past, because some of them were the same persons I used to smoke ganja with and stuff. So they knew how
Mm-hmm.
the transformation, and they knew it wasn't a joke. Um, then I went to Bethel, and I
Could
was
you spare
still.
that thought just for a quick minute? We take a quick break and take care of this time signal.
You are safe for your home and a shop lead alone, want a car for your own. You're never alone. Just turn to your family. My Credit Union.
The time my credit unions are Jamaica, my credit union, my family is.
It's a 3:30, heading on to 3:31 inside Alive, and I'm with Pastor Francios Meek of the Redeemed Deliverance Church of God. Continue, man of God. You were sharing that.
Yes.
You were preaching. Yeah.
So I went to Bethel, and Bethel had this tradition where they would have an initiation process. Kind of like a joke, you're the newbies and stuff. So the seniors would test you. They'd ask you questions, and a part of it too was to find out your level of tolerance, to see whether or not you were really called, and to be mischievous to a certain extent, but on a more serious note, to find out what your giftings are. So it was a mixture of fun, but seriousness at the same time.
Yeah.
And throughout the week, they weren't having, some people were feeling the pressure. Like for me, because I was not worried about, they give you nicknames and stuff, but I was not worried about nicknames. So I'd embrace the names, and they say we should preach and stuff. You had to preach a church sermon, and you had to preach an evangelistic sermon, and you had to do like an impromptu speech, and all this sorts of stuff. When I did my in church sermon, they laughed at me. They were rolling. Everybody was rolling because, when you talk about preaching from a theological perspective, you talk about hermeneutics, you talk about homiletics, interpretation and structure. And I chose Psalm 23, and I felt like I knew what I was preaching, but what I was preaching had nothing to do with the text and the context, were referencing. And so I was just matching up some scriptures, and they rolled, man. They had a laugh. They laughed at me. They laughed at me, man.
At Bible school, huh?
Yes, man. They laughed at me, man. They laughed at me. But for me, that was not a deterrent. That was not going to get me down.
Okay.
I knew I had another preaching to do to redeem myself in a few days. So I said, okay, I am going to work on this, and I got some help. I got some help. A good friend of mine who was murdered last year at his home, Patrick Brown, a pastor, he took me in, and he helped me. He gave me some stuff, some tips and stuff, because he liked me. So yeah, it wasn't supposed to help you, but he gave me a few tips and stuff, gave me a few ideas, and I went back for them the Friday night, last night, and this was an evangelistic service now, and I was the last person who preached. And when I was through preaching, what was meant to be just, probably another laughing for them because they expect you to come a certain way, the Holy Spirit just took over the entire place.
Wow.
And some of those who were running the initiation process started to speak in tongues, and they started to worship broke out. Worship broke out. From that day, they never, ever grubbed us again. Then that process was done.
You rescued your entire batch.
Yes, man. That was it. That was it.
Wow.
Right? So these things helped me to solidify, my calling and stuff. And then there were other times I was questioning, whether or not I was, what was I called? Yes, I can preach, but what is my gifting per se? What am I supposed to do with this? And there's this particular time we had this lecturer by the name of, he died, I think last year or somewhere there, Reverend Snyder. And one day when he's not there, his wife usually comes and sit in for him. And she came one day, sat in for him. And as she sat in for him, she was having a prayer session with us. And as she was praying for me, in my heart, I said, God, let me, whatever you call me for, as relates to my giftedness and my area of specialization, I want you to let this lady say it as she prays for me. Because I usually do these things with God. And as she was praying, not even 5 seconds later, she said, Lord, we thank you for the gift of evangelism in this young man.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I said, okay, then God, okay, thank you, because this was a prayer I prayed in my heart. She never heard me praying this prayer, so that again was a sign that this is what God has
Awful.
called
So,
me
so God
for.
was just using different scenarios to
Yeah,
bring a
definitely,
level of
definitely,
assurance in your heart.
definitely, definitely,
You
definitely.
mentioned something earlier, and I didn't want to forget that Pastor Peko, or I'm not sure if it's
Peku,
Pastor Bishop.
Peku,
Peko, yeah,
Dwight Peku.
I've heard that name before. So yeah, yeah.
Yes,
He mentioned to you that you should have died because of attacks from witchcraft or beer.
right, right,
Were
right.
you aware of that? Those were things that you were alerted to.
Yeah, definitely, definitely, definitely. Because I said my grandmother was a praying person,
Mm.
and she would have picked up on these things, and
Oh,
she would have mentioned these things. And then when I got saved and my mother got saved, my mother was much much stronger than I was in our early years.
yeah,
Because as
yeah.
I mentioned last, that she received the power of the Holy Spirit even before she was
Before
baptized,
she was baptized, yeah.
and she sometimes would pick up on some of these things. I'd be going out and she would just started praying for me. She'd anoint me with oil, olive oil, and she would just get the Bible and just, put it on me, and all kind of Pentecostal crazy stuff. And
Yeah.
I was aware, I was aware
Okay.
that these
Okay.
things
Oh,
were present in my life. But yeah,
yeah.
so
Wow. Amazing. But back to ministry, so that was solidified. You knew, you know, moving into being a pastor. How has that been? Because you've been a pastor now for 10 years there in
yeah,
Trelawney. How has
yeah.
that been? What are some of the lessons and experiences that stand out in your mind?
Well, I mean, for one, pastoral duty is not for the faint of heart. Um,
We're talking to one, so I can
yeah,
concur.
yeah, and I think it is something that an individual has to be sure that he or she has been called to.
Hmm.
I don't think calling has anything to a certain extent many times to do with passion or one's liking, because God do call people to things that people don't like. Over time, you become appreciative of it, and you become submissive, and you work with it. I, for one, I, I am one of those persons who I can't say I have loved it from the beginning, and I
Hmm.
embraced it. I went along reluctantly because I figured that, hey, I wouldn't want to know that the Lord has called me to this thing, and out of disobedience, I missed this
Mm.
mark. And I had so many experiences with God, where disobedience is concerned. I have a mark on my hand now from which I got 5 stitches when I was in college,
Yeah,
um, which came as a result of disobedience. And that's always a reminder for me that,
don't do it.
yes,
Don't do it.
I have to try and stay on track as much as I can,
Yeah.
because there can be problems there. But the ministry, I mean, the ministry is great. It has many highs and many lows. One of the greatest things for me is seeing how people's lives transform
Hmm.
as a result of the impact of your ministry on their lives, as God uses you to take them from where they were and to just transform their lives. Um, so I've had many of those experiences, and those experiences for me are most rewarding, they are most fruitful. And I've had many lows. I've had times when I feel like, I just can't be bothered with this. I don't think I'm going to survive another week. I want to go. But in the midst of that, I feel bound to it by virtue of my commitment to God, by virtue of
Yeah.
what I have said to Him from the beginning,
Hmm. Hmm.
that wherever you call me to, whatever you've called me to do, irrespective of how I feel about it, I'm going to put my feelings aside, and I'm going to allow you to work things through.
Wow.
So irrespective of how I feel, most of my decisions are not by virtue of feelings, they are not by virtue of emotion. I'm emotionally unattached when it comes on to making decisions most times, because feelings can get you in trouble.
True.
And so my journey has never been about how I feel. It has always been calculated. I've always been a rational person, to the point where some people think that, boy, I'm too cold because
Of the rationale, yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. But for me, rationality trumps feeling every time, you know. And so that is what has kept me,
Kept you going,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Obviously.
Just reasoning it out that irrespective of how I feel, this is not my call. This is God's call, and I am here to serve Him. I am not here to make money. I am not here to glorify myself. I'm not here to make a name for myself. I'm here to serve Him and to glorify Him.
Powerful, powerful, powerful. You certainly haven't abandoned your scholarly aptitude. You have a master's in apologetics, something that I'm fascinated with myself,
Yes.
and you also you were a part of the Discovery Institute's C.S. Lewis Fellows Program.
Yes.
How important is it for you to continue in your own heart to continue, with education and development?
Well, a part of my calling, apart from preaching, those who know me very well and who have known me over the years have dubbed me the preaching machine. But apart from preaching,
Yeah.
from very early, I felt called to a life, the life of the mind. I
Mm,
felt like life of the mind was very important. That I ought to be able to think clearly in order to function effectively in ministry. And coming from a Pentecostal background, I felt a burden to study, to show myself approved,
yeah.
because of the notion that people have of Pentecostals, that Pentecostals are just people who jump up and down and make a lot of noise, and that we're empty and so forth
So you
and so on.
wanted to bring a level of intellectual rigor
Definitely,
within that circle as
definitely,
well.
definitely,
Okay.
definitely,
Wow.
and bring a certain level of respect, to the Pentecostal community, because we have many intelligent minds, we have many great minds, but because of how we have been portrayed by a lot of pastors who just say stuff and that's it. People will take the minority and will feel as though, boy, that is how it is. So I felt called to this, and I felt called to educating the Christian community, here locally, regionally, and internationally. Yeah, I felt that that is a part of my calling, and that if
Mhm.
God has given me a good mind, God has not given me a good mind to waste, that He has given me to use,
Powerful.
for His glory. And as one of my lecturer at Bethel said many years ago, he said that, Reverend Plummer at the time, he said, if God never intended for us to 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 read and to study, then God would not have given us a Bible. The mere fact that God has given us a Bible means that God demands that we read and study. And the Bible is no easy book to handle if you are going to handle it carefully. So it requires discipline, requires rigor, it requires years of study. And I've committed myself to balancing the scholarship with the anointing.
Wow. Powerful. I tell you, there's so much more we could talk about, especially balancing the scholarship with the anointing. But it's really been refreshing hearing part two, hearing some of the stories that you've been through. Thank you so much. I am telling you. I am telling you. Um, Powerful stuff. Really, really, really encouraged by it. And I want to encourage you to continue doing this great work that you're doing for the glory of God. Thank you again, Reverend Francois Meek.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And just
All the
before I go, I
very
saw some people who know me,
Yeah,
both
man.
here and
Shout them
abroad.
out quickly.
I just want to shout them out. My mother, shout out to my mother, Lynn Maureen Campbell, and my brother, Leighton Matt Gibbon over there in Virginia. All my community members from St. Mary who are listening, my students from Midland Bible Institute who are listening, Anne Marie, I see your post, Miss Daphne, who was one of my nurses when I was a baby, she is listening as well. And just to everybody who has been supportive. Please continue to pray for me. Thanks to Love FM. Thanks to Fabian, a friend of mine. at whose church I did internship in my younger years. God bless you, and thank you all for this wonderful opportunity.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. God bless you, and all the very best. All right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, man.
Thank you.
Take care.